To state the obvious, Japan is an island nation. Surrounded by seas, throughout its history, Japan would fend off outside invasions, fuel rampant piracy, and even isolate itself for hundreds of years. To do this, Japan needed to have mastery of the waves. It is interesting to examine how the warriors of Japan came to accomplish this, the unique warships they built, the tactics they utilized, and of course, the battles they fought. Samurai naval history is perhaps just as important as their military exploits on land, yet not nearly as covered in popular media. So, that is what I'm going to do here today. Examine the evolution of samurai warships and navies throughout the ages, not only diving into their usage against each other, but also the battles they fought against foreign foes. How well did Japanese warships compare against those they encountered from other countries? Let us explore how the samurai took their fight to their enemies at sea. The history of naval warfare in pre-modern Japan can be a difficult thing to research. In English, sources appear rather limited, and although more work has been done by Japanese historians, finding specific info can be a complicated process. Regardless, there are still plenty of details we can still piece together. We do know a bit about the great naval encounters throughout the Genpei War of the late Heian period, and later that of the clashes fought against the Mongol invasions throughout the late 13th century. However, the real height of naval warfare in pre-modern Japan, when we can finally begin to chart the rise in designs of true Japanese warships, did not arrive until the Sengoku period, when samurai clans began to build increasingly large and impressive warships which they not only used in conflicts throughout their own country, but also against the naval forces from Korea throughout the eventual Imjin War. What should also be mentioned, though, is the role of piracy in Japanese naval history. As I have touched on in the past, for centuries, much of what other countries knew about Japan was specifically related to pirates. The Wako or Woko pirates from Japan plagued the surrounding seas for many years, even eventually prompting an armed invasion from Korea to attack Tsushima in 1419 in aims to claim the island and clamp down on pirate activity in the area. Despite this, the rise of significant pirate leaders and groups from Japan is perhaps the primary way many historians view Japan's maritime development over the ages. As Peter Shapinsky puts it in his book Lords of the Sea, Pirates, Violence, and Commerce in Late Medieval Japan, pirates constituted one of late medieval Japan's faces to the world. They were among the first Japanese that foreigners met, transporting, protecting, piloting, or attacking visitors from overseas. They also helped integrate Japan into global shipping networks that were beginning to twine around the earth. And while we could spend a lot of time here talking about the role of pirates in this video, that is such a large topic that I believe it is well suited for its own video at some point. The main focus of this video, though, will simply be to provide a broad evolution and overview of samurai warships and naval warfare, not only in Japan, but also against foreign countries. This will not be a video trying to overanalyze every minute detail or one specifically aimed at a single period in time, despite the fact that I might have a lot more to say about one over another. This was also a topic covered in a great collaboration I was a part of a couple years ago. Back then I made a video just solely covering the battles of Kizugawaguchi. However, Scott from Sengoku Studies and Anthony Cummins also made some great videos talking more broadly about Japanese naval warfare and ship design. I will leave links to all of those videos down below. Lastly, before we officially get started, I do want to mention that if you are someone who is very interested in samurai naval warfare and tabletop gaming, I might just have a game for you to check out. Many years ago, WizKids released an awesome game called Pirates CSG, or Constructible Strategy Game. It was basically a card game where you collected various packs, punched out ships from the cards, built the ships, and then used those ships in naval warfare and plunder against your opponents. all while equipping each ship with unique crew to expand upon a wide range of awesome abilities. This was one of my favorite games back when I was in middle school, believe it or not, and it is one I actually continue to play with friends to this very day, as through eBay and other online marketplaces we have continued to purchase ships and expand our fleets. The game itself sadly only ran from around 2004 to 2008, but there is still a great and active community dedicated to the game. And one of the primary leading figures in this community is Ben from Pirates with Ben, who has been able to help the game continue on by not only helping players with rules and guides, but also designing and releasing new sets of ships. What is really awesome and related to this video is that he has recently released an amazing new set of ships from an all-new Tokugawa Shogunate faction. This set is called Pirates CSG, and it includes all sorts of awesome new designs we have never seen before in the game, as well as new crew members taken right from real history. I have bought a couple of packs for this new set already, and I have to say the quality is absolutely outstanding. This would be an awesome game for you to check out if you want to experience samurai naval warfare as a tabletop game. You can buy packs of this new Seas of Japan set on his website, Pirates with Ben, which I will also link down below. Just keep in mind, due to the fact that Ben has to print these new packs himself, supplies may be limited. And like I said, you can still buy all sorts of ships and packs for the game on eBay and other marketplaces if you find yourself wanting to dive in even deeper. It really is a great game. For more info on the game itself and the new sets, check out pirateswithben.com as well as his YouTube channel, which I will link down in the description. With that said, let's wade our way back into history and explore some of the earliest examples we have of samurai naval warfare. Now, just as Sengoku Studies did at the start of his fantastic video, I think it would be good to cover some terminology here at the start. Traditional Japanese ships are often called wasen, sen meaning boat or ship. This character though can also be read as fune. However, Japanese warships in particular are often referred to as hyosen or heisen. As mentioned earlier, the idea of a true Japanese warship did not arise for centuries, despite the fact that ships were still constantly being used for military purposes, with some of the earliest examples of ships being used in Japanese conflicts being seen throughout the Genpei War. Unfortunately, there is little to nothing remaining today of older ships, apart from artist renditions of them which were often made in later ages. Yet still, we can sort of figure out what these ships looked like and how they would have functioned. Now, the Genpei War was the greatest conflict in Japan up until that point, and as we know, it would solidify the rule of warriors in Japan for centuries to come. Throughout the course of the war, several large-scale naval engagements would occur, with the most famous of which being the legendary final battle at Dan no Ura, which was fought at the Shimonoseki Strait, which separates Honshu from Kyushu. It has been debated, though, whether ships of this time can truly be defined as warships, that is, ships being designed and outfitted solely for military purposes. Rather, these early ships, from the records we have of them, describe and depict them as perhaps ships converted for the means of fighting at sea. These early designs can almost be depicted as floating platforms on which warriors were crammed onto. Using oarsmen to move the vessels, the warriors on board would either utilize archery for ranged engagements or various other long-shafted weapons for closer engagements, favoring polearms to hook and drag men off enemy boats. However, in close combat, if deck-to-deck skirmishes would arise, short-bladed weapons would have become the most ideal. Some ships might have also been outfitted with defensive structures, such as tate, standing shields, to protect against enemy arrows. These early ships came in several sizes, with larger ornate designs and smaller designs, perhaps inspired by some Chinese vessels. And it should be obvious that these ships were not designed for ocean voyages, but are rather intended for staying near the coast, which would make sense given that they could easily be utilized as troop transports, moving men as well as horses swiftly. The Heikei Monogatari even describes an incident at the Battle of Mizushima in which the Taira would link their ships together as to make one large deck for the movement of troops during the battle, Whether or not this was actually something that really happened can be debated. However, it does fit the nature of what we kind of know about these early conflicts at sea, using these floating platforms to create a battlefield on open water. And this is where I will make my own argument that these early designs perhaps should be considered as warships, despite the fact that they do not necessarily fit some typical definitions of that term. Although they did not have additional armaments on board and may not have been initially designed for naval warfare, they still utilized features which fit the requirements of Japanese naval warfare well for the time, and thus could be further outfitted to meet the needs of battle. However, let's move forward in time a bit to now examine Japan's first major conflict against a large foreign naval force, that of the Mongol invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281. Now, contrary to popular belief, and in fact some statements I have made in some of my older videos, the Mongol invasions of Japan were not won solely by the arrival of the Divine Wind, massive typhoons which arrived to wreck the Mongol navy. Rather, recent studies have concluded that it was the Japanese themselves who truly beat the Mongols, engaging them not only on land but also at sea. Contemporary depictions of Japanese warriors facing off against the Mongol invaders portray epic naval clashes, as Japanese warriors leap onto enemy vessels to cut down Mongol warriors with short-bladed weapons. Such scenes are amazingly displayed and described in Thomas Conlan's great book, In Little Need of Divine Intervention, which explores the truth of the conflict. By the point of the Mongol invasions, the Yuan dynasty, which was ruled by Kublai Khan, extended far across Mongolia and most of modern-day China, with additional tributary states in Korea and Southeast Asia. Thus, the majority of vessels they took with them on their invasion were that of traditional Chinese junks, flat-bottomed ships with a central rudder and large sails. However, Korean ships would also have made an appearance as well. Additionally, smaller oared vessels would have been utilized. The Mongol navy would have dwarfed that of what the Japanese could have put forth. But that does not mean the Japanese were helpless at sea against them. The first invasion in 1274, in which the Mongol forces retreated from, was later followed up by another invasion in 1281. The Japanese had learned a great deal from fighting against the Mongols during the first attempt, and one of the aspects in which the Japanese made adjustments was how they fought at sea. Ultimately, the Japanese knew they would never be able to compete against the massive size of the Mongol fleet, yet they were able to utilize tactics which picked off portions of it. It is not entirely known what this may have looked like, but a common explanation would be that after repelling a Mongol incursion along the coast, Mongol forces would retreat to their ships, prompting Japanese warriors to board their own vessels to chase them down. These Japanese vessels, though, were smaller boats which were more easily maneuverable, thus closing in on specific targets and allowing Japanese warriors to swarm on board the larger Mongol ships to slay their crew and set fire to them. This is believed to have happened on multiple occasions and was a contributing factor to Japan's success in the second invasion. So, as we can see, when faced with an outside threat in this instance, the samurai were able to adapt to swiftly and effectively face down their foes at sea. But as we will witness soon enough, their efforts would be challenged much more effectively the next time they would face a foreign enemy in the water. However, it is now time we move on to start getting into the rise of what many consider to be real Japanese warships, as we tread further along into Japanese history, eventually reaching the iconic Sengoku Jidai. It was during this age that not only can we see the expansion of more dedicated warship designs, but also later into the period the arrival of matchlock firearms, which the Japanese would come to utilize heavily, not only shifting the face of warfare on land, but also warfare at sea. On the water, these weapons would prove to be crucial for not only picking off enemy sailors, but also blowing holes into enemy ships, with one of the most devastating firearms that Japan would come to use being that of the ozutsu, which were literally handheld cannons. Although the samurai would never fully incorporate actual naval artillery widely into their ship designs, ozutsu were the next best thing, being used to shatter the sides of enemy vessels. Now, by this point, we can examine the emergence of three specific classes of warships. Smaller vessels, which were called kobaya or kobayabune, medium vessels known as sikibune, and large vessels known as atakebune. To start off, kobaya being the smallest meant they were the most agile. In fact, these ships resemble much of the earlier designs we have covered thus far. Simple platform vessels used for archers or to maneuver in close with warriors ready to board enemy ships. They could also easily be outfitted with defensive structures, such as wooden shields or even roofs. They were ideal for a wide variety of purposes and were likely the most produced ship of the age, and even into the following Edo period, as we will come to see. Up next, sekibune were mid-sized ships, utilizing both oars and sails, which made them very fast. They could have multiple decks and also featured shooting holes for soldiers to fire arrows or later matchlocks from. Being obviously larger than kobaya, they could pack more sailors on board, not only making them ideal fighting ships but also ideal transport ships. Throughout the Sengoku period, we can see a rise in the Japanese shipbuilding industry, in some cases spurred forth specifically due to the wars of the age. Some clans took to using the seas as a necessity, such as in the case of the Shimazu, who during their war against the Ryozoji in the 1580s began ramping up their ship construction in order to amass a sizable fleet to seize the waters north of them while also transporting troops and supplies to Hizen province. For other clans, taking to the seas was more of a convenience, as using the water was a great way to avoid hostile territory for the purposes of trade and transportation. Yet, doing so was still somewhat of a risk thanks to continued piracy. The last Sengoku-era ships to cover are that of the atakebune, massive warships unlike anything else we have seen so far. The Japanese constructed different varieties and styles of atakebune, but they can be easily described as large floating fortresses. In fact, some even came to closely resemble castles on the water, being that some atakebune even sported tenshu-like structures atop their decks. And like sekibune, they also featured multiple decks and shooting holes for projectiles. However, despite their large size making them an intimidating ship to attack, their slow speed and low maneuverability was also a tremendous weakness. To account for this, some of the finest atakebune were outfitted with iron plating, such as the 6 atakebune that the Sea Lord Kuki Yoshitaka presented to Oda Nobunaga in 1578. These ships have come to be referred to as tokosen, which literally translates to mean ironclad ships, prompting some to consider these vessels as potentially the world's first real ironclads. But that is certainly a point that can be debated. These ships would be utilized by the Oda forces at the Second Battle of Kizugawaguchi, facing off against that of the Mori and Murakami navies. The Oda had lost the first battle 2 years earlier, yet with the introduction of these new super heavy ships, the Oda were able to seize victory, cutting off supplies to the besieged Ishiyama Honganji, a great stronghold of the Ikoiki. As mentioned earlier, I previously covered these two battles in another video. And while the tokosen were able to shine at Kizugawaguchi, it does not change the fact that atakebune were not usually seen as mainline combat ships. In fact, atakebune are more thought to have been utilized as command vessels and troop transports. And this fact can potentially give us a clearer picture of what the makeup of a typical Japanese navy for the Sengoku period might look like. We can assess that speed and maneuverability were key, thus the smaller kobaya would have likely been the most numerous ships in a fleet, with the larger sekibune brought in for support. And then lastly, the atakebune, which would have served, as mentioned before, as a command vessel where orders would be dispatched from. Of course, for a samurai clan to even produce a large navy means that they would need to have significant stockpiles of wealth and resources, as well as a pool of experienced craftsmen and laborers to build the ships. We can also see clans form alliances with pirate lords as a means to amass a fleet, but this was not always an option. Our earlier example of the Shimazu paints a good image of what a self-sufficient clan would look like, building their own naval force for military needs. Yet another factor to consider would be the sailors themselves. It is one thing to build or possess a navy, it is another thing to have competent crews manning each ship. Obviously, the best crews would have had some history of piracy, men who would have gained their experience already operating on ships for large portions of their lives. Daimyo with significant navies would benefit greatly from usage of such men, at least until the arrival of Toyotomi Hideyoshi's edicts against piracy in the late 1580s. It was here, in efforts to eliminate the practice, all sailors were required to take oaths of loyalty to their legitimate lord. This may have had a negative effect on ensuring experienced crews remained in service. But getting back to the ships themselves, despite these vessels serving their needs rather well in the seas around Japan, it is another thing to compare them with foreign navies in battle, which would come to happen during the Japanese invasion of Korea, otherwise known as the Imjin War, fought throughout the 1590s. It was here Toyotomi Hideyoshi amassed one of the largest naval forces Japan had ever seen up until that point in order to secure the sea lanes and thus seize the land. And although Japan would score several significant naval victories over the course of the conflict, for the most part, Japan was on the receiving end of disastrous naval defeats. Historians have largely attributed this to two main factors, one being the heroic Korean Admiral Yi Sun-shin, whose campaigns and tactics would prove invaluable, the other being a unique new class of Korean vessel which the Japanese were not able to properly deal with. These were the turtle ships, or kobukson, not necessarily large vessels but more the size of small or medium ships. Kobukson had a genius design to them that thwarted Japanese styles of naval warfare. Completely walled along all sides and sporting an armored roof that is often depicted as being lined with spikes, they would have been immune to most light-ranged fire from Japanese ships, as well as difficult to board. Yet what truly set them apart were their usage of cannons, something which, as we mentioned earlier, the Japanese never fully adopted onto their own ships. Because of their highly defensive nature and powerful attacking capabilities, when under the command of a competent leader, these ships were able to win the day for Korea on numerous occasions. Now, it should be known that these ships were not the main vessels used by the Korean Navy. In fact, their numbers might have been rather sparse, but their impact was still significant. Japan would end up pulling out of Korea by 1598. Ultimately losing the conflict due to a combination of factors ranging from not only the Korean victories at sea, but also the intervention of forces from Ming China and persistent Korean guerrilla warfare. Now, while Japan would suffer defeats against these foreign vessels, there would of course be other foreign ships that the Japanese would come into contact with throughout the period. With the earlier arrival of European traders and missionaries to Japan, also came the arrival of European-style ocean-going vessels, often referred to as kurofune, or black ships. Despite Japanese attempts to purchase some of these ships for themselves, it would not be until the very end of the period that Japan was finally able to replicate their designs. This would come with William Adams, an English navigator who would arrive in Japan on board a Dutch trade ship called the Liefde. As we know and have covered on the channel in other videos, Adams would arrive in Japan in 1600 and would eventually come to serve under Tokugawa Ieyasu. In time, Ieyasu would instruct Adams to build him a new Western-style ship, which Adams would do, helping to pass along what shipbuilding knowledge he knew to Japanese craftsmen. Now, it is believed that several other Western-style ocean-going vessels would be built in Japan. Yet, with the country soon entering into the new peaceful Edo period, and the coming of a new age of self-imposed isolation, today known as Sakoku, military as well as maritime technology would start to decline, following the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate and their many restrictions aimed at clamping down and maintaining the peace. Because of this, it does not appear that Japan would produce many ships of this design. In fact, throughout the early 1600s, a series of edicts from the Bakufu would continue to limit the size and scale of ships that daimyo could build and possess. This in turn left the small Kobaya-style ships as perhaps the most numerous military vessel used by domains throughout the majority of the Edo period. Now, this then brings us to the final period of Japanese naval warfare history that we are going to be exploring in this video. That being right at the tail end into the Bakumatsu period and Boshin War, as modern designs would begin to emerge. Although Japan was aware of updated Western-style ship designs due to trade with the Dutch through the port of Dejima in Nagasaki, it would not be until after the arrival of U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry to Japan in 1853 that the Tokugawa government would begin a change of course in their shipbuilding. The Bakufu would soon after remove the prohibitions they had in place on large ship construction and finally begin the process of constructing new modern vessels. By the 1860s, the Bakufu had further ramped up ship production, bringing in not only foreign designers but also purchasing a number of foreign-made ships. In fact, one of Japan's first modern ironclad vessels happened to be a ship originally built in France, but was intended to be given to the Confederate States of America during the American Civil War. This ship would eventually be given the name the CSS Stonewall, yet it never reached America before the end of the war. Thus it came into the hands of the US government, who by 1867 would then sell it to Japan. Japan would at first name it Kotetsu, and it would come to see action during the Battle of Hakodate at the end of the Boshin War. Following the end of the war, though, it would be renamed to Azuma. By this point, we are moving into the rise of the new imperial government, in which Japan would expand its naval forces exponentially, eventually going on to successfully challenge the navies of Europe. But that is another story beyond the realm of pre-modern Japan. Looking back, we can see that the warships and naval warfare of the samurai evolved much like anything else. Necessity breeds innovation, as the saying goes. Whether it was making alterations to simple platform ship designs in order to use them in naval engagements during the Genpei War, learning from the first Mongol invasion and utilizing smaller boats that best countered what their foes had to offer, building larger dedicated classes of warships to control the surrounding waters during the Sengoku period, and eventually playing catch-up during the Bakumatsu period as to amass a modern fleet not only to be used initially for conflicts in Japan, but then later to springboard off of to develop an impressive navy on the world stage. And although the warships of the samurai didn't always measure up to that of their foreign enemies, Japan's unique ship designs throughout history were ones bred to fit the needs of samurai warfare, leading to some of the country's most storied battles. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.